Tonight, a story about flowers, and about how stories go wrong. It is the winter of 1636 in the Dutch Republic, and for a few months some people are paying astonishing prices for tulip bulbs. You have probably heard a version of this. Tonight we will go through what the actual records show, which is quieter and stranger than the legend. You do not need to hold on to any of it. There are no numbers to remember and nothing to work out. If you fall asleep in the first minute, the story will have done its job. Start with the flower itself, because the flower is genuinely worth a moment. The tulip is not a Dutch plant. It grows wild in the mountains and steppes of Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, in Iran, in the high country of Turkey. It was cultivated for centuries in the Ottoman world before anyone in Western Europe had seen one. Bulbs and seeds reached the Low Countries in the second half of the 1500s, largely through scholars and diplomats and botanical gardens, and one man in particular, Carolus Clusius, who planted them in the garden at Leyden and studied them carefully. What struck people about the tulip was the color. European garden flowers of the time were mostly soft. The tulip was not soft. It was saturated. A flat, intense red, or a deep purple, or a clean white, arriving on a bare stem in early spring when very little else was happening. It looked, to eyes that had never seen one, almost artificial. And it was slow. A tulip grown from seed takes something like 7 years to flower. You could not simply make more of them because you wanted more. That slowness matters later. Then there were the broken ones. Some tulips, unpredictably, produced petals that were not one color but two, with flames and feathers of color streaking a pale ground. These were the prized ones, the ones with grand names. Semper Augustus, white with vivid red flares. Viceroy. Admiral van der Eyck. They were beautiful in a way that ordinary tulips were not, and they were rare, and nobody knew how to produce them on purpose. A plain bulb might break and become one of these. It might not. The bulbs of a broken tulip could be multiplied by offsets, small bulbs growing from the parent, and those offsets would carry the pattern, but slowly, a few a year at best. Here is the part that nobody in the 1600s could have known. The breaking was a virus. A mosaic virus, carried between plants by aphids, which disrupts the flower's ability to lay down its color evenly and lets the underlying pale layer show through in streaks. It was not identified until the 20th century. The most valuable flowers in Europe were valuable because they were quietly, elegantly ill. And the virus weakened the bulb, so the finest tulips were also the feeblest, and the least willing to reproduce. The country these flowers arrived in was doing rather well. The Dutch Republic in the 1630s was one of the wealthiest places in Europe. Ships coming in from the Baltic with grain, from Asia with spices. A merchant class with money and no aristocratic land to spend it on. Painters everywhere, producing pictures for ordinary households at a rate no other country matched. Collecting was fashionable. Not just flowers. Shells, prints, porcelain, maps, curiosities. A man might have a cabinet of rare shells and be respected for it, and pay sums for a single shell that look, to us, every bit as odd as the tulip prices. Nobody tells that story, because a shell mania makes a less tidy parable. Tulips fitted neatly into that world. They came with a literature, too. Growers produced beautifully painted catalogues, tulip books, showing each named variety in watercolor, partly as a sales tool and partly because a bulb out of season is an unpromising thing to show a customer. Several of those books survive, and the flowers in them are still bright. To own a Semper Augustus was to demonstrate taste and knowledge, not merely wealth. The people involved in the trade, we now know, were not the general public. They were mostly well-off merchants and skilled craftsmen, often connected to one another already, through family, through trade, and quite often through church. Many of them were Mennonites, a small and tight-knit community. This was a network of people who already knew each other, dealing in something they all cared about. Now the mechanics, because they explain almost everything. Tulip bulbs can only be lifted from the ground for a few months in summer, after the flower is finished. For the rest of the year the bulb is in the soil, growing, and cannot be moved. So if you wanted to trade in tulips in autumn or winter, you could not trade in actual bulbs. You traded in paper. A contract, promising to deliver a named bulb of a named weight when the ground was next lifted, at a price agreed now. Nobody handed over money. Nobody handed over a bulb. Two men agreed, in writing, to complete a sale in 6 months' time. The Dutch had a name for this kind of trading. Wind handle. The wind trade. Because that was all that changed hands, air. And the contracts moved. A man who had agreed to buy could sell his position to someone else, who could sell it on again. By the winter of 1636, a single bulb still sitting quietly in the earth outside Haarlem might have been promised, on paper, through a chain of half a dozen people, none of whom had paid anything yet. There was one more wrinkle. Ordinary bulbs, as opposed to the great named rarities, were traded by weight, in a unit called the AAs, which was tiny, about 1/20th of a gram. A contract might promise a bulb of a particular variety weighing so many AAs, delivered in June. Part of the gamble was that a bulb left in the ground grows. Buy in December and the thing you eventually receive will be heavier than the thing you priced. The wind trade was, in that sense, partly a bet on quiet growth underground during a Dutch winter. The trading happened in taverns, and it was cheerfully informal. Groups called colleges met in back rooms of inns. They had their own rituals for making a bid, involving slates and written offers passed back and forth, and a small payment from the buyer to the seller to seal the deal, called wine money, which was frequently spent on wine. Food and drink were part of the evening. The atmosphere by all accounts was sociable and slightly boisterous. There was no exchange, no clearinghouse, no regulator, and crucially no mechanism to force anyone to pay. It ran on the assumption that people would honor what they had agreed, which, in a tight community of neighbors and co-religionists, was normally a fair assumption. Prices rose through the autumn of 1636 and rose steeply in January of 1637. The rise moved beyond the rare broken tulips into ordinary bulbs sold by weight, which had not been treated as collector's items before. That is usually the sign that something has changed character. And then, in the first week of February, it stopped. What happened was very quiet. At an auction in Haarlem on the 3rd of February, there were no buyers. Not a crash, not a panic in the streets. Simply a room in which nobody bid. Word traveled, and within days the trade across the towns of Holland had gone still. Prices for tulip contracts fell to almost nothing. And here is where the real story separates from the famous one. Because almost nobody had actually paid any money yet. The contracts were for delivery in the summer. The buyers owed sums on paper that they had not handed over and now did not want to hand over. The sellers had bulbs still in the ground and contracts that nobody would honor. It was a mess, but it was a mess made mostly of unpaid promises rather than of vanished savings. Growers and dealers appealed to the authorities. The city of Haarlem asked the province for guidance. The provincial court, sensibly, told the towns to sort it out among themselves. In the end, most contracts were simply cancelled, or settled at a small fraction of the agreed price, a few %, and the matter was closed. So let us deal plainly with the legend, because it is worth dismantling gently. Most of what people repeat about Tulip Mania comes from a book published in 1841 by a Scottish journalist named Charles Mackay, called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. It is a wonderful, readable book, and on this subject it is largely unreliable. Mackay was drawing on an 18th-century German writer, who was drawing on satirical pamphlets published in Dutch in 1637 by people with a moral point to make. Those pamphlets were not reporting. They were sermons in the shape of dialogues, written to warn readers about greed. They exaggerated on purpose. Mackay read them as history. From that chain we get the sailor who supposedly ate a priceless bulb thinking it was an onion. We get the crowds of chimney sweeps and weavers selling their homes to speculate. We get the ruined merchants throwing themselves into the canals. None of it appears in the archives. And Goldgar, a historian who spent years going through notarial records, court papers, wills and inventories in Dutch town archives, found no drownings, no wave of bankruptcies caused by tulips, and no sign that the wider economy noticed at all. What she did find is more interesting, and quieter. She found a few hundred people, not thousands. She found that many of them were already prosperous, and stayed prosperous. She found that the sums involved, while large, were not ruinous for most of the men who owed them, and that in any case most were never paid. And she found that what actually distressed people was not money but trust. These were communities that ran on the idea that a man's word held. Suddenly friends were refusing to honor agreements made in front of witnesses. Neighbors were taking neighbors to court. Church congregations had members who would not look at each other. The pamphlets and the paintings that followed were not really about finance. They were about honor, and the fear that a society built on promises might find its promises did not hold. That fear was real. The economic catastrophe was not. There was no depression afterwards. Dutch prosperity carried on. The one group who genuinely suffered were some of the growers, who had spent a season's work on bulbs nobody now wanted. You can see the anxiety in the art that followed. There is a small painting by Jan Bruel the Younger in which the tulip traders are all monkeys, weighing bulbs, counting coins, feasting, and finally being carried off to court. It is a joke, but it is a nervous one, and it is about behavior rather than about ruin. And the prices? Some of them were extraordinary, and that part is true. There are recorded contracts for single bulbs at 3,000 guilders and more. One much-quoted figure has a Semper Augustus offered at around 10,000 guilders, and a good house on an Amsterdam canal at that time might have cost something similar. So the comparison people make, a flower worth more than a house, is not invented. But it needs two footnotes. First, the very highest figures come from the last few weeks, from contracts that were never paid and probably never could have been. A price agreed is not a price received. Second, a skilled craftsman might earn perhaps 300 guilders in a year, which tells you these were not transactions ordinary people were anywhere near. The other quiet correction is geography. Amsterdam is where we always set the story, and there was trading there, but the real center was Haarlem, with its sandy soil that suited bulbs, and the smaller towns around it. Alkmaar, Enkhuizen, Utrecht. It was a provincial business, conducted in market towns, by people who mostly knew each other's fathers. It is worth asking why the wrong version has lasted so well. Part of it is that the wrong version is a better story. It has a moral, a rising curve, a fall, and a lesson at the end, and it can be told in 90 seconds. The true version has ambiguity, a small cast, an anticlimax, and a court decision about contract law. Part of it is that every generation with a financial bubble of its own reaches back for Tulip Mania as a comparison, and each retelling smooths it a little further. And part of it, I think, is that we would rather believe crowds go mad occasionally than believe that reasonable, well-informed people, trading in a market they understood, among friends, can still end up somewhere absurd. That second thought is less comfortable. The tulips themselves went on perfectly well. The Dutch bulb industry did not collapse. It grew, steadily, for the next 400 years, until the fields around Haarlem became the largest flower-growing region on Earth, exporting billions of bulbs a year. The broken tulips, though, have mostly gone. Growers eventually understood the virus and worked to remove it. The flames and feathers you see now are bred, deliberately, and healthy. So we leave it there, in February, with the trading rooms gone quiet and the bulbs still underground where they always were, doing what bulbs do, entirely unaware. Nothing burned. Nothing collapsed. A few hundred people had an awkward spring, and a story got away from them and grew for 4 centuries. Sleep well. Somewhere out there, under cold soil, something is slowly getting ready to be a flower.